Let me preface this by noting that this revenge was not my doing. At least, not exactly. It happened back in the 90s when I was in high school and centered around the type of school I attended. So, in case you weren't aware, it's very common in agricultural communities to have what are known as farmers' schools. That's not a technical term, but more just something easy to define them. The schools are generally organized by the local farmers, and while you still study the various courses needed to get into college, you also study farming technology courses and get credit hours for work study, i.e. working on one or more farms. The area I lived in was surrounded by a number of large farms which grew cotton primarily. So during the year, we'd spend time out in the field both tilling, planting, and harvesting. One of the farms near the school was this 1,000-acre spread that, like the others, grew mostly cotton, though sometimes they rotated to soybeans or silage. Basically corn, but you don't harvest it. This farm had a long partnership with the school, so the students provided near free labor for the farmer. The farmer leased this property from some out-of-state owner and paid them a portion of the revenue from the harvest. Imagine my surprise then when I and many of my classmates arrived at the farm to do our work study, and the farmer instructed some to crew the sprayers and start spraying herbicide on the fields, while others, myself included, were to take tractors and discs and plow everything under. The farmer wanted every square inch of the fields returned to just dirt. We were shocked, to say the least, but after some discussion we set to work. It took us the better part of a weekend to do so, and when we were done the field was in a beautiful, if barren, state. The farmer thanked each of us personally and paid us about $500 each. Quite the sum for a 90s high school senior. We returned to the school, told our headmaster that the contract was completed, and he informed us that the farmer would no longer be working with the school, and we be sent to one of the other larger farms for the rest of the year and our work study. It was probably 2 or 3 months later before word started going around about why we'd been instructed to destroy the crop. Granted, these were just rumors, but based on how things turned out for the farmer, I suspect there's some truth to it. So apparently the landowner had decided that he was going to not renew the lease the farmer had on the land. This lease renewal just so happened to fall a few weeks before harvest season would start. Given that the average cotton farm earns about $1,500 per acre, a 1,000-acre farm would easily net the owner $1.5 million, about $500,000 of that being pure profit. I don't know what the farmer's lease was, but it stands to reason that it wasn't anywhere near that. So this landowner had figured out a neat little trick. Let the farmer get a good crop planted, and then refuse to renew the lease. The farmer would leave the plants in the field, and the landowner would just need to pay some contractors to come harvest it, and they'd earn a profit. Since at the time, the farmer's lease wasn't yet up, he decided to prevent that from happening. His act of revenge against the owner was to prevent them from cashing in on their hard work. Sure, it destroyed his farm, and he had to sell off most everything he owned to buy some property for himself, but he proved a point. The owner did try to sue the farmer, though he, the owner, really didn't have a leg to stand on, or so I was told. I think the court ruled that since the farmer was still under the lease when he had the land tilled under, then it was his property to do with as he wished, and thus the landowner couldn't tell him what to do with his property. I learned a rather valuable lesson from that man, beyond what I learned about farming. That lesson was, never, ever cross someone with nothing to lose. Edit. Since it was brought up in the comments, let me add some details here. Cotton is one of the few crops which leave a negative nutrient value in the soil, meaning that after harvest, even if you till the dead plants under, or even if you till them prior to harvest, you won't have as much nutrients as you started with. That's why farmers will plant another crop, usually winter wheat, in place, and then till it under rather than harvesting it. This is something commonly called a green manure, but it works to put nutrients that the cotton pulled out of the soil back into it. While the ground wouldn't have been completely dead or sterile, any crop planted on that tract of land without further treatment of the soil, wouldn't have produced the same acre per acre yield that a comparable crop would have. Had he gone to harvest and planted the secondary crop, which means that the landowner would either have to plant the green manure and spend money that way or pay by the ton to use artificial fertilizer.
Next story.
I started dating a girl about 7 years ago. When we met, she was getting up on her feet and trying to find her way in life. I let my imagination take over and started envisioning her potential and what kind of life we would have together. I had never had the feeling of disarmed, punch-drunk love that I had for her, and that probably clouded my judgment. Throughout our time together, she would reach out and ask for money for things, repairing a car, paying a bill, etc. We were getting closer the longer we dated, and I would always help her, assuming that I was making an investment in both of our lives by helping her through a period of instability. In all, I probably gave her about $15,000. After about 4 years of this, I finally popped the question. She accepted, and we were married after a brief engagement. About 6 months into our marriage, she told me she had been having car trouble and needed about $2,000 for the repair. This struck me as a bit odd. By that time, I was more than familiar with her vehicle and knew her explanation for what the issue was didn't make sense. One evening after she went to sleep, I went and had a look at the part of the car she had said was faulty. No issue. This set off alarms. I grabbed her phone and, on a hunch, typed in the amount she had asked for, and it returned a text message with a guy she had previously dated. Apparently, he had reached out and asked for help repairing his car. And lo and behold, he had asked for the same amount she had requested from me. My stomach turned as the thought entered my mind that maybe I had subsidized other of this guy's expenses across the time I had dated my wife. As I read through the messages further, I realized that this guy was the Lester Diamond to my Sam Rothstein, and I had been played like a fool. Look up that reference if you're not familiar. I had spent my entire relationship as a proxy sugar daddy. I thought on this for a few weeks and tried to figure out what to do next. These sacrifices were not insignificant to me. I had been working as a surgical resident for much of our courtship, making very little money, and working long hours to form a strong, solid foundation for our future. This was devastating, and I realized that I couldn't reconcile the situation. Once I had cooled down, I waited for an evening. My wife went to bed early, and I got into her phone. I caught up on the most recent messages she and her paramour had sent one another. Then I initiated a conversation with him. I posed as her and told him she had been drinking. She is a recovering alcoholic, and that she needed to get some things off her chest. I didn't go overboard, but I did send messages to the effect that she was not over him, and that her affections had grown since marrying me. I all but teed him up to move in for a relationship with her. I then abruptly ended the chat and asked that we not talk about the conversation again in order to avoid furthering her relapse, but that we both keep in mind what we had spoken about and see if we could make a life together work. I then deleted the texts from her phone and hoped the two would proceed forward together. They did. I kept an eye on the texts for the next few months and progressively saw things heat up between them until it looked like she was committed to leaving me. We didn't have many assets together at the time, as I was still finishing a surgical residency, so I knew the divorce would be quick and painless, and that we would go our separate ways, and she would start a new life with the guy whose underachievements I had been funding. So I filed for divorce and had her serve papers. I was generous with the $10,000 in assets between us in order to make the split as quick as possible, and went on our ways to begin life anew. And you'd think that is the end of the story, right? Oh no, friend. You see, Mama didn't raise a cuck. In our state, not only are assets separated upon marital severance, but so are debts. And medical school is fucking expensive. Really expensive. $250,000 expensive. So the bitch ended up with a parting gift of about $125,000 of my student loans. And guess who she shotgun married 2 months after our divorce? Fortunately for her, she'll only have to pay half of that amount. Because if history does indeed repeat itself, he'll be paying the other half once their marriage ends as well. It was all I could do to not send them a piggy bank as a wedding gift. Best $15,000 I ever spent.
Next story.
This incident blew up in March 2021, in the middle of lockdowns and stuff. It would probably be recognizable to people I work with. Hopefully they don't read this thread, haha. It's a story about someone whose ambition was bigger than their ethics and the law, and it coming back to bite them. It's a bit long, sorry. TLDR at the bottom. At the time, I was working as a manager in a mid-sized business. While I was there, I was assigned a new member to my team. I'll call her Evil. Evil was in her mid-20s and was pretty fresh out of college. She was the kind of person who could talk your ear off about all of her ideas and plans and what she was working on, but never really seemed to have anything to show for it. When I talked to her about clients complaining that she wasn't getting back to them, she would always have an excuse about how difficult they were, how snowed under she was, and how she had written an email, but it must have gotten lost in spam. So on and so forth. Basically never her fault. It got to the point where after one of our monthly meetings I called her in and explained that if she couldn't get her tasks done she needed to let us know, so we could help delegate resources to make sure things weren't slipping through the cracks. I'll admit, I was pretty direct. Her performance was impacting the whole team, and my job was literally to keep the team on track. I get that people can be under pressure, that there can be stuff going on at home which impacts work, and that sometimes people need a bit of help. But if every time I ask about a project you say, yep, everything's good, I've got it under control, and then it all falls apart, and your only response is to blame the client, we have a problem. I explained that I wasn't going to start formal performance management or anything like that, but from now on I'd like her to check in with me on Monday mornings for 10 minutes to go over objectives for the week and to check if she needed support with any of her clients. I know it isn't fun to be micromanaged, so I tried to keep these check-ins short and mostly just offer assistance on stuff. She clearly hated my guts though, and apparently was hatching her own pro-revenge. Now part of my role included use of a purchasing card, which wasn't in my name but I had access to. I was given the card to basically make small purchases for the office or spend up to $500 on clients. The card was kept in an office I shared with another team manager, where we both could access it when we needed it. One day I get a call from accounts asking about a few abnormal purchases on the card. A Photoshop subscription, a couple of Uber Eats orders, an HBO subscription, etc. I say I don't know anything about them, and they should check with the other team manager. Apparently the other team manager didn't know anything about them either, because after the weekend I get called into the big boss's office. After my colleague and I had denied involvement, accounts had started calling Adobe and Uber and stuff to find out where the transactions were coming from. They said that not only were the accounts in my name, they were registered to an email address with my name in it too, igwordroll3@domain.com or something. I can't describe what it felt like to be in that meeting. I felt physically sick. I couldn't work out what was happening. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was about to get fired, and I couldn't understand how that was even possible. The director was going on about how access to the card was a privilege and that I had signed an agreement about appropriate use, and so on and so forth.
Next story.
I'm not sure if this one belongs here as I was not the one actually wronged. My revenge was taken for someone I have never met, and I honestly don't know if they personally got any satisfaction from it. I do know what it did to the perpetrator and that it satisfied me, so I'll let the readers decide. Like many of my tales, this one takes place in the distant past, before cell phones were common and before universal caller ID was the norm, in a time dinosaurs most likely roamed the earth. Well, the 80s at least. These things are very important to this story. Our tale takes place in a large West Coast city known for a big orange bridge and delicious sourdough bread. I was living in the city for several months working temporary duty for my company, and was preparing for work on the day in question. As was my custom, I was getting dressed listening to the morning radio show on a local station. This station's jocks had started doing something called the Monday morning wake-up call, where on the first day of the week, they would make a prank call on the air to a victim chosen from write-in suggestions from the listening audience. Doing this was actually very controversial in radio circles at the time. I had been a radio DJ in my hometown for a few years, and there are rules you must follow. One of the biggest rules is that you can't make a false or deceptive radio transmission, like announcing an emergency, sending an SOS or cry for help or other such deceptions. Doing so is a federal offense. You can lose your license and be fined, or even do jail time. It's a big no-no. The debate has long since been decided, but at the time doing prank calls on the air was a gray area. There were people who were sure it constituted a false transmission, and some stations refused to do it. The argument was still alive at the time this happened. This day happened to be Monday, and the intended victim had been nominated by her husband. They had experienced a power failure at home earlier in the week, and the husband suggestion was that the station called his wife, claimed to be from the utility, and tell her that the power outage was somehow their fault, and they would have to pay for it. The station staff loved the idea, and they proceeded to call the wife at her place of employment, a local bank. The victim answered and the prank began. "Hello, is this Mrs. Victim? I'm John Doe from Area Power Company. Do you remember having a power failure earlier this week? Well, it was due to a blown transformer on your block, and we've determined that the cause is a wiring fault in your house. We may have to cut off your power until you get it fixed. Also, you will be charged for the transformer. The total cost is X $1,000. Would you prefer we put that on your utility bill, or do you want to make other arrangements to pay?" As you might imagine, the woman was shocked, then scared. As she asked for more information, having trouble believing that they were going to have to pay thousands of dollars, she got increasingly more upset. This egged the radio staff on. The guy making the call kept increasing the pressure on her more and more, eventually telling her that her power would likely be cut off until payment was made, and that there might be a lawsuit. After several minutes, she suddenly hung up in tears. He called her back, and when she heard his voice, she hung up again, crying even harder. This time, the guy waited a minute, and then called back again. Another lady answered the phone, a coworker, and he asked to speak to Mrs. Victim. When the coworker asked his name, he replied, "This is her husband." Distinctive first name. The coworker cursed at him, called him a liar, and hung up. The radio studio was filled with laughter. The jocks thought it was hilarious. They took calls from listeners who were all laughing and talking about what a great prank it was. They finally got the husband on the phone, he of the distinctive name, and he was also laughing and joking that he'd surely be sleeping on the sofa tonight. He was congratulating the radio staff on the fine job they had done terrorizing his wife. The radio hosts promised the listening audience that, because the prank was so funny, they would certainly be playing the whole recorded prank again at noon. So be sure to be listening, and call your friends. I, in my efficiency apartment listening to this, was getting mad. I was still pretty newly married, and couldn't imagine doing something like that to my wife. All I could think of while the staff and listeners on the radio were laughing was that, a few miles away, a young woman was in the ladies' room crying, probably with coworkers trying to calm her down. What made it worse to my mind was that the guy who set her up for this was the one guy in the world who should have her back, her husband. Anger turned to resolve. Resolve formed a plan. I grabbed the city phone book, remember, it's the 80s, and looked up 2 phone numbers. I called the first one. You may remember that I said I had been a radio disc jockey myself. It was a tiny, dawn to dusk station, but I knew how stations worked. I knew what they liked, and more to the point, I knew what they did not like. I also had done a lot of voiceover work and could sound professional as heck. The phone rang and was answered. "You've reached K******, Radio Jerk." I launched my attack. Me. Professional voice. Yes, this is George Smith. I picked a more believable name. From the city, Office of the Federal Communications Commission. I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it. Radio Guy 1. Stammering. He's not. Here right now. Let me get you some meals. I was put on hold. After a few moments. Radio Guy 2. Also stammering. Hi. Hello. This is Radio Guy 2. You're from the FCC. Me. Yes. This is George Smith from the city, Office of the Federal Communications Commission. As I told your coworker, I've been getting some disturbing calls about your morning radio show, and I need to speak to your program director to discuss it. Radio Guy 2. Short silence. He's not in yet. He'll be here at, 9 o'clock. Me. Well, I can start with your station manager since he will need to be in the conversation as well. Radio Guy 2. Breathing fast, starting to lose all his composure. Oh wow. He gets in at 9 too. I can. Can I have him call you? He half-asked and half-pleaded. Me, letting out what I hoped was a bureaucratic-sounding sigh. Very well. I will expect to hear from him at 9. I will need to speak to your station manager, your programming director, and very likely your on-air personnel from this morning. I'll also need your station logs. Radio Guy 2. Oh yes, sir. I'll make sure he calls you right away. Me. All right. I'll be expecting his call. Here's my number. At this point, I gave Radio Guy 2 the second number I had looked up in the phone book, the main number for the city, Office of the Federal Communications Commission. Radio Guy 2 stammered his thanks and promises of phone calls, and we hung up. I went back to the radio. Jerk disc jockey. Oh boy. The FCC is calling. Well, they can't do anything to me. I've got a year of pre-law in college and blah blah blah. He continued his defiance for a few minutes and then went to commercial. I kept listening. They stopped talking about the prank call. They stopped taking phone calls from listeners. They stopped talking to the husband. They started playing music. A lot of music. I listened for the rest of the day. They didn't talk about it the rest of that day, and they didn't replay it at noon. In fact, for the rest of the week I listened and heard nothing about it. I was a bit surprised. I figured that they might stop talking about it for a little while, but not altogether. It wasn't until later that I realized why they went so silent. I had scared them. In my quest to get a little vengeance for that crying woman I'd never met, I scared them, but more to the point, I'd embarrassed them, and Jerk Disc Jockey had helped. Once he went live with his bravado against the call from the feds, their listeners knew they'd been called and heard the silence afterward too. They were embarrassed because I had just done to them what they had done to her, and they didn't want to have to admit it. I've kept the rather distinctive name of the husband a secret because I have always wished that I could meet that poor woman, and that name would be how I would know it was really her. I doubt she is still married to the guy, but I'd like to let her know that in that place, on that day, someone had her back.